Good morning. Today is 26th of April already. How time fly?
Yes.
So today we're going to cover e-invoicing part 2. Basically we will talk about two main issues. One is consolidated e-invoice. Second is SelfBilled e-invoice.
Yes.
Okay. With me is Miss Lim. She is our customer relationship manager. I'll be with moderator. She will be take the lead to explain all these so-called technical matters. Okay. Without due delay, let's start. Miss Lim, I know there's everyone is talking about e-invoicing, but within e-invoice, there's two main categories, which is, I think the basic one, which we did weeks ago in part 1, basically cover the basics, okay?
Yes.
Now it's moved to a secondary or intermediate level, whereby we will talk about consolidated e-invoice. Also, we'll talk about sales invoice. Let's start off with consolidated e-invoice. What is it?
Actually, the consolidation e-invoice, from the word consolidate, we will understand is a combination of the business transaction in an invoice where at the point of sales, at the time of point of sales, where the buyer do not require for the e-invoice. So this usually happens to business to consumer, B2C, where the end consumer may not require the e-invoice as the proof of expenses for the businesses. So I can take, for example, is the hawker store who run the business, where you as an individual person go and tapao, go and buy the food, you do not require for the e-invoice.
I think, let me recap a bit of the part 1 of the e-invoice. E-invoice basically is affect everybody, every taxpayer in Malaysia, as long as you are doing business. Okay, of course, just now what Ms. Lim had mentioned is that basically B2C basically is, rather than B2B or something like that, B2C is business to consumer, whereby consumer is not doing business like you and me, going to tap out food, things like that in hawker centers. Okay, when should consolidated e-invoice be issued?
The supplier needs to consolidate all the transaction on a monthly basis, and then it's required to submit to validation to LHDN within the 7 calendar day after the month end.
Okay, this is as at 26th of April 2024. Okay. This is based on the current rulings, okay? I don't know what is going to be changed. Stay tuned. Keep update on from government announcement, okay? So what is the deadline? You have mentioned 7 days after the
month end, each year,
each calendar month, okay? Step by step.
Okay, for the step by step, I generally categorize it into 4 steps. Number 1 is at the point of sales, the supplier need to ask the buyer, do you need the e-invoice? Then followed by, if the supplier, the buyer do not need the e-invoice, the supplier can just issue a normal receipt to the buyer. And then within the 7 days after the month end, the supplier need to retrieve all the transactions during the month, consolidate it and issue the e-invoice, consolidated e-invoice, and upload to the system for verification. As this step by step, there's a slightly difference in part 1, where we mentioned there's a rejections can be done, and you have to share the invoice with the buyer. So under consolidated e-invoice, I point out there's a difference, which in this situation there's no rejection of the e-invoice, and also there's no sharing of the invoices to the buyer.
I see. So basically it's like you compose everything.
Correct.
Okay, in Bahasa we call it combo.
Combo.
That's why in English we call it consolidated. The main reason is because your buyer is consumers.
Consumer and no running business.
Not in the business.
Yes.
Okay, so we know. I think there's many fields requires in a normal e-invoice.
Yes.
Okay. In part 1, please go back to part 1 if you're not clear about the e-invoice. Okay. So what data field are required upon issuance of the consolidated invoice?
From here, I'll just point out the important data fields that require, because initially we mentioned there's a buyer's name require, but since this one is a consolidated e-invoice, basically it's a public, it's a general. So there's a standard for you to put in as a general public under the buyer's name. Then followed by the TIN number, tax identification number. So IRB also set a standard code, which is EI, then 000 a lot, ending with 2-digit 10.
So basically this will cover the general
Public.
Yes. Rather than in the normal typical e-invoice, each taxpayer is required to produce the TIN numbers.
The TIN number and the name.
Okay.
And then the description part, because this one is a consolidated e-invoice, they given you 2 options of method. One is the summary of each receipt. The second alternative is list out the receipt presented in line with the item.
I see. Any others?
No, basically this is the main difference compared to the standard one.
So I think recap, basically every time at the point of sales, business taxpayers require to ask you and me, do you require e-invoice?
Yes.
I think this is very tedious, right?
Especially for hawker.
Yes.
Yeah.
So basically, maybe sometimes I think for business owners, sometimes they also have events, business event, company events, marketing events, right? Not all the food was going to buy from event organizers. Sometimes we also buy food from hawker, right?
Yeah.
So let's say this time around we have a birthday celebrations, monthly birthday. We also say, please issue us a tax invoice. We don't want
We don't receipt. We need e-invoice.
invoice. I think there's a lot of hoo-ha, okay, for taxpayers. I think, as I say in the part 1, I think computerization, automation is the most important thing to implement e-invoice. Okay, next. What kind of industry is allowed to issue e-invoice?
I mean e-invoice. The business industry which not allowed to issue e-invoice, which is example is there's a 7 industry.
So basically, there are only 7
industries.
designated industry can allow for consolidated e-invoice. Okay, not allowed. Okay,
Not allowed.
sorry.
Not allowed for e-invoice. So industry number 1 is automotive, followed by industry number 2 is aviation, which is the flight. Then followed by luxury goods and jewelries, construction company, and then those wholesaler or retailer of construction materials, licensed betting and gaming industries, and follow the last one is the payment to agents, dealer and distributor. Yes, so this 7 industry is not allowed to issue consolidated e-invoice, meaning they have to issue the e-invoice, the standard e-invoice.
Okay, so I think complication comes in. Okay, if a B2C buyers initially don't want e-invoice, at the point of sales they say I just want a normal invoice. subsequently roti canai. Okay, the consumer says, I want a e-invoice. Can this be done?
Yes, it can be done. The seller actually able to switch the receipt that at the point of sales that they issue to the e-invoice, provided with one specific condition, where the buyer come back to request for the e-invoice within the same month before the submission.
Ni cari pasar saja lah.
Betul.
Business is tough already. I think you still have to entertain this kind of roti canai issues. You want or you don't want, and then ends up you want, and then we have to reissue the e-invoice, things like that. Okay.
Yes.
So with this, more or less, we cover the consolidated e-invoice. I think we shall move to a second point is SelfBilled e-invoice. Okay, what is it? What is it?
From the word self-build means you build to yourself.
Okay.
Then who? Means the buyer required to issue e-invoice to himself under some certain unavoidable circumstances. I give a very clear example is that when you purchase some goods with your foreign supplier, where your foreign supplier not necessary to accommodate with Malaysia's rules and regulation on the e-invoice. So this is one of the obvious example where the buyer required to self-build himself, meaning issue the e-invoice to himself.
I think let me recap. I think basically in the typical scenario is normally e-invoice is issued by suppliers. Okay, self-build meaning it come from buyers. Okay, one of the unique circumstances is foreign sellers. Okay, you don't ask Singaporean to issue you an invoice. Okay, I don't think they will buy our
rules.
They will say look at it all. You buat sendiri. Okay, so basically ends up we have to self-build ourselves. Self-build sendiri. Okay, anything you want to elaborate more?
Yeah, of course. The second round is I have to let you know the types of transaction that require self-bill. So 7 types. First one is the payment to the agent, dealer, and distributor. Followed by the second one is the as I mentioned just now, the example, purchase from a foreign supplier. Then another one is the profit distribution for companies who pay out dividend. E-commerce also is one of the type. Then payout of all the bettings and gaming winners. Then last two is purchase from individuals not carrying out business. For example, let's say I collect stamps as a hobby. And then the last one recently announced is the interest payment.
So basically there's a 7 type of
Transaction.
main category of transactions is required to issue a self-billed invoice. Okay,
Yes.
I think we are clear about this. Okay, how do you issue the practical one? How do you issue the operational one? How do you issue?
Yeah, as mentioned just now, buyer have to bill sendiri. So buyer need to issue the self-billed invoice where the supplier don't take the role. So the supplier no longer required to issue the e-invoice. Then followed by the step 2 is the buyer after issue the self-bill, you have to submit the e-invoice to Inland Revenue Board for validation. Then after IRB, the last step is when IRB validate the e-invoice, the buyer able to use this e-invoice as a proof of expenses for the tax purpose.
I think basically it's the same. It will be the same of the typical e-invoice. Instead of issue from supplier, it will issue from buyers. They will go through the same process.
Yes.
Okay, so same data fields. I think what type of data fields requires on self-billed invoice?
Because under self-billed invoice, you may encounter a situation where the supplier may only provide you either the IC or registration number or TIN number, either one. So for the first scenario, where the suppliers only provide the TIN number, so the field that affected is the TIN. You have to fill in according to the numbers that are given, and then for the IC and registration number, you just need to fill 000. Okay, then
So let me recap. The TIN number is specific one.
yes, specific one.
From the supplier
Correct.
TIN numbers, okay?
Then under scenario 2, where the supplier only provide the IC,
Okay.
or the registration number or the passport number. So the TIN number, there's a general code delegated. For Malaysian, you have to fill in EA000 ending with last 2 digit 10. And then if the supplier is the foreign supplier, it's the same EI000 with the ending last 2 digit is 30.
So basically, there's 2 types, okay? TIN numbers. One is local, one is foreign. Am I right to say?
Yes.
Okay? So
yeah.
other than that, is quite normal, right?
Correct.
So I think more or less we have covered the basic consolidated e-invoice and self-billed e-invoice. This is a basic. Of course, stay tuned. We have more e-invoice sharing sessions coming out in coming days or in coming months. Okay, so we keep in touch.
Correct.
Thank you, Ms. Lim.
Thank you, Mr. Cole.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.